So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar talking about wealth, purpose and stewardship in a family business. My name is Elizabeth Bagger. I'm the Director General at the IFB, and I am absolutely delighted to be joined by a partner and friend of the IFB, Franco Lombardo from Veritage in Canada. And I will ask our good friend to introduce themselves and just tell you all a little bit about what it is that he does with families before we then get started on the webinar. On a practical note, we have about an hour together today, and if you do want to ask any questions during the webinar, there is a Q&A button on your screen below, and if you want to write questions there, we will pick them up and answer them as we go. So Francesco, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so great to be here, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a treat to come to London. It's my favorite city to come and visit in the world, so anytime I get a chance to come here, I'm all over it. So I'm the managing director and founder of Veritage, and what we do simplistically is we work with business-owning families just like yours across the globe, helping the humans get along with the other humans. Because as we all know, human beings are wonderful and they're awful. You know, they can be great and awful at the same time. And it's the humanness that gets in the way of relationships and business transactions, family dynamics, and ownership decisions. So we help the humans be nice to each other.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we said this webinar was about wealth, purpose and stewardship in family business. Could you unpick that a bit for us? What does that mean to you?
So our definition of wealth at the firm is family wealth is made up of three components. It's made up of financial capital, which is the obvious that most people think about and come to mind. It's made up of human capital, which is the individuals, and social capital, which is the collection of individuals and their collective brand and reputation. Our belief that the most valuable asset class in that portfolio is the human capital, because properly developed and groomed, they will impact both the financial capital and social capital at the same time. And within that category of asset, the subclass is the next generation, which I think is the most valuable asset class any family has. So it's really about developing and grooming the next generation who will impact the financial capital and social capital exponentially.
Thank you. And you talk a lot about safe space when you talk to families and when you write your books. How does that relate to a family's wealth?
So, you know, what I find interesting, and, John Davies, who's the gentleman that created the original three-circle model of family business, when I shared with him the new concept, one of the things that he pointed out was that as a industry and as families, we've been focusing on the systems, the family system and the business system and the ownership system. And we sort of overlook somehow that these systems are made up of humans. They're made up of human beings. And one of our fundamental basic needs as a human being is to want to feel safe. We want to feel safe in our relationships. We want to feel safe with our environment, which includes our family. And we want to feel safe with our wealth. Unfortunately, most of us don't feel safe because of things that happened to us in the past. So the idea of safe space is about creating that environment where we can have the conversations that we need to have in a safe environment without feeling judged, ridiculed or made fun of.
Thank you. We obviously talk a lot about transfers and succession here at the IFB, and it's a topic that most people have an active relationship with because there's always a next succession to think about or to plan. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the examples you've seen in working with families where that transfer or that succession has gone incredibly well, and what led to those successes, and what were some of the things that people had to look at along the way in order to get there.
So I think the first thing is I like to debunk the idea of succession, because succession is a one-time event. Succession occurs when you're transitioning the leadership or the ownership from one generation to the next. And families that really get this piece right focus more on continuity. Continuity is a longer-term vision than succession. So in continuity, there'll be many successions. But if we focus on the continuity versus the succession, we'll get a longer-term perspective and plan accordingly. So families that have done this successfully will focus on the human capital. It always comes back to the human capital. You know, if we get the human capital piece right, everything else works. Because if you think about it, if we unpackage all the roles and responsibilities, like, you know, if you take away the role of CEO and father and mother and shareholder and director and auntie and aunt and grandmother, we're left with a human being. So if we got a good human being and we have good human behavior, by default, there'll be a good CEO, there'll be a good parent, there'll be a good successor, a good inheritor. So continuity of the human is the key. It's about developing the human beings for a longer term view than just this one event called succession.
Right. Have you worked with any families where something really interesting emerged in order for the family to move from maybe not feeling quite safe in terms of handing over to feeling safer and therefore doing it more
So I've had the privilege to serve one particular family for 11 years. And it's not because they're slow learners. There's just a lot of complexity in the family. And one day dad comes to me and says, you know what, I'm thinking of making my boys, has three boys, shareholders in the outfit. He calls it the outfit. And I said, you know, that's a great idea. But first of all, have you considered what's it going to be like to have new playmates in your sandbox? Oh, never thought of that, he says. And then I said, and by the way, those playmates are going to be your sons. Oh, yeah. And then I said, you know, have you ever considered whether they may want to play with your toys? Maybe they don't want to play with the toys. They don't like this construction toy, this railroad toy. We should find out if they really want to play with the toys first. He said, yeah, well, let's do that. So I spent a year with each of the boys who happened to be between, I'd say, early 30s to mid to late 30s. And after a year, the oldest son came to the conclusion that he did not want to work in the family business because he didn't like the toys that were there. And the other reason was his way of connecting is through creating conflict. So he didn't want to come in and be the disruptor in the system. And as he put it, to quote him, I would rather be able to go fishing with my brothers when I'm 70 than have worked in a family business and not have a relationship like my father has with my uncle.
Right.
Right. So by focusing on the human capital of this, they happen to be the fourth generation. We want to get really clear. You know, do you want to be involved in ownership and leadership in the outfit or not? And then he's successful in his own right, doing his own thing, but he just chose not to be involved.
Right. And where does the purpose piece come into this? Because it's obviously there and very important, but is that where you start when you start working with a family, or how do you get to the purpose piece?
So everything we do as human beings, we do for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
What we say, how we behave, who we interact with is all based on a reason. But here's the catch. Most of us have no idea what that reason is.
Mm-hmm.
So we're out there repeating behaviors, doing things, and not knowing what's going on. And as a good friend of mine says, it's like our ego is in control of our lives, frankly, without our permission. So that's one extreme. So everything we do for a reason, which is either based on our story or our belief, which is one extreme. The other extreme is either our purpose, what we call safe space, or a desire to contribute. Most human beings have no idea what either of those are. So they're out there operating with this thing running their lives without them even realizing they're running their lives. So purpose is the flip side of our conditioning. So, for example, my story was that I was beaten by my father when I was younger. My mother was inappropriate with me growing up, and I was sexually abused when I was 11 by a teacher. So my belief, my story became that I'm not valuable, that I'm disposable, that there's clearly something wrong with me. And I never felt safe as a child. My personal purpose is to create a safer world because I never felt safe as a child. So I want to create a safer world, and the medium that I do it through is family-owned businesses, because I believe that if individuals feel safe in family businesses, the business will prosper and together we'll change the world. So purpose is the flip side of our story. So in order to find our purpose, we need to understand what our story is. And here's the key, without judging it. Those were things that happened to me. They had an impact on me. And one of the things that I talk about is being grateful for the gift of insignificance that my parents gave me. Because had it not been for that gift, I would not be serving who I'm serving today.
That's very powerful. So that makes me think, so if I can get to the point where I understand my personal purpose, how does that feed into the purpose of us owning a family business collectively? And how do you have that conversation with the family once they're clear on their own personal purpose?
So let's talk about what safe space is first, and then we'll get into the purpose piece. So safe space, if you can grab a pen and a piece of paper, boys and girls, and draw a Venn diagram. So the circle at the top is individuals. The circle on the left, let's call that relationships. And the circle on the right, let's call that wealth. We call this the 3-circle model of safety that a colleague of mine and I co-created. So the individual has to feel safe with themselves first. In other words, they got to be comfortable with who they are as an individual. They have to be competent in their decision-making, both intellectually and emotionally. They must be confident in their abilities, both intellectually and emotionally. They need to understand what their gigs are, which I'll get into in a second, which are our default mechanisms. They need to understand what their money model is, which is their subconscious belief about money. And finally, they must be comfortable dealing with conflict in a healthy manner. So once an individual can feel safe, so once I feel safe and Elizabeth feels safe, together we can create what's called relational safety. And once we've got relational safety, we can create what's called familial safety. And then we can create what's called cultural safety. So when there is that safe space, we can have any conversation at any time, regardless what the issue is, because it's not going to be taken personally. We're not going to get judged. We're not going to be criticized because we feel safe having the conversations. And by the way, as human beings, we all want to be able to do that. So what I've discovered is once an individual is living or operating in safe space, they shift, they change, and people are drawn to them. They just want to be part of them. They want to talk to them. They want to be in their energy. And I've got countless stories of individuals that we started working with, and then eventually the entire family gets on board because they've seen a transformation in that individual because they just own who they are. And by the way, safe space, simplistically, is basically your core value. So, things like integrity, transparency, vulnerability, and you're either living your safe space or you're not. There's no gray area.
Right. But what about the transition phase when you're moving through from where you are to where you want to get to?
So, the world likes to operate in threes. So the first thing we have to do is we got to find our safe space. Then we need to create it. And finally, we need to maintain it. And the maintenance piece is the most difficult piece because, as human beings, we've got a way of being. We're familiar with how we do things, who we've become. My mentor, Dov Barron, calls it the land of familiar. When we operate in this thing that we think is safe, it's actually an illusion of safety, but it's really familiar. And safe space is on the other side of that. So we have to find it. It's in us. It's inside there. It's hidden beneath the story and the conditioning and all the beliefs that we hold to be absolute truths, which actually aren't. So once we find it, we can create it. And once we've created it, we have to maintain it. And I remember having a conversation with my coach a number of years back. I was actually in London, and I was feeling incredibly lonely one day. I was here for the weekend, and I was seeing all these couples together and friends together, and I'm just going, oh my God, I'm lonely, and what a loser, and all this. I just started to devolve. So I talked to my coach about it, and he says, think of yourself as a satellite between two planets. You've got the planet of the past, so I can go back to those people and not feel lonely, but I'll know what that's like. Or I can stay where I'm at as a satellite and be drawn towards the planet of my future. So I gravitationally be pulled to that. But the old tendency is to go back to the old way of being, right? So the maintenance is the hardest piece. And as I tell my clients, safe space is a way of being. That's what we call it, governance in action. It's because we live it, we become it, we be it.
Thank you. So walk me through a scenario here. Let's say I am the CEO of a multi-generational business, and I'm thinking about passing on the management of the business, preferably to family, but who knows? We haven't quite defined yet whether there is a successor on the management side, but we do know that we want to transition to the next generation in terms of ownership. And I have possibly siblings and cousins in the business as well. Where do I start? If I think I want to find a successor, I don't know if the next gen are ready, I don't know if they want it, and I don't really know how my cousins and siblings feel about this because we haven't really started that conversation yet. What would we as a family do?
Well, it starts with education, Elizabeth, right? You know, it amazes me how many successful families, and by that I mean is size of wealth, been around for a long time, have never seen the three-circle model of family business, right? So we start with education. Let's understand what we are part of, right? Mm-hmm. We're part of this very unique, complicated critter called family business that has a lot of complexity and moving parts to it, and is very emotionally driven because family business are made up of human beings, and human beings have these funny things. I'm going to say the F word, feelings, and feelings get in the way of rational decision making, right? So we educate. The family. We talk about, you know, the biggest risk of the system is what we call behavioral risk of the human being, because the common denominator in all three circles is a human. So if that human devolves, behavioral risk is the biggest risk to the entire system, the family dynamics, business decisions, and the ownership decisions. So what is behavioral risk? We talk about the three-circle model of safety. We talk about the money model, which is a subconscious belief about money. We talk about the safe space equation, which we'll get into in a second. We talk about what are the six behaviors that people engage in as a way of, call it coping mechanisms, which get in the way of relationships. We talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which are the four big issues that all families face. So education is key. And then only once folks are educated and we get a lay of the land, can we start having the big conversations about who is who and where is where, and what's qualification look like, and what's the roadmap. I think families put the cart before the horse many, many times.
It sounds like this kind of work requires quite a bit of patience and resilience.
Well, it's a process, you know. I think, you know, as human beings, we want, you know, here's the magic pill and poof, we're cured, and you know, we've lost the weight, we're beautiful, and we're in love, and everything's great, you know. But it doesn't work that way. It takes, you know, years and years and years to create wealth, and it's going to take a long time to, not years and years and years, but it'll take time to equip and prepare and understand and want to change behavior. You know, and it's fascinating to me that I work with a lot of families that have the traditional, you know, governance in place, or they got their constitutions in place and their charters. And these are wonderful documents, right? But the focus and the emphasis is always on the business side of things, the ownership side of things, policies and procedures for business decisions, ownership decisions. But where's the piece that says, how do we as human beings get along? You know, where's that roadmap? Where's that recipe book on, you know, here's how we agree, here's our guiding principles on how we're going to treat each other as humans. And it's the human being that gets in the way, always. You know, I'm working with a family right now. They got an incredible constitution. They've got their family values in there. But when I interviewed the family members, I think 70% of them had no idea what the values were. Out of the ones that knew, everyone had different definitions for values. Because, you know, as human beings, we attach subjective meanings to words. If I say the word elephant, what comes to mind for you? First thing comes to mind.
A large gray animal.
Large gray animal. Rebecca, what comes to mind for you? Africa. For me, it's Dumbo. And that's a simple word like elephant. Right? When we start talking about words like integrity and transparency and vulnerability and respect, these are ethereal concepts. So unless family members are really, really clear what the definition is, how can they expect to behave and live? Right? So it starts with education, always. And it's a process. It takes time. Yes. You know, I've got families I've been working with for 11 years, you know, 6 years, 7 years. It just takes time. And, you know, the other thing is families that focus on continuity will have a budget for education for the most valuable asset class, which is the human capital. You know, if this is our most valuable investment that we have, why wouldn't we continually upgrade it, equip it, make it better? There's a family that I work with that has an education budget of $1.5 million per year for the family. It's a big family. There's 40 members. But the point is they put that money away and it's used as an investment for the human capital.
And how do they measure return on investment if they do?
It's a great question. So one of the things that we created for our clients is a tool where they can actually measure their progress.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's 8 categories, which are the 8 main concepts or themes that we coach on. And they're actually able to measure on how they're doing. They come up with a number. So, it goes from 0 to 96. So 8 categories, scale of 1 to 12 in each category. And they can measure their progress and what they need to focus on between one coaching session and the next. We're also working on a tool to be able to measure behavioral risk. So a family could say, when we started, the behavioral risk was this. When we finished, the behavioral risk was that. So ROI is this.
And what would how would you define a behavioral risk?
Well, so we create a matrix so you can measure it. Right? So if you can measure, you can see progress. Right? So there's one thing to say, well, I have more integrity. Well, okay, how do you know? You speak the truth all the time? Well, no. Do I speak the truth more? Yes. So then, therefore, I have more integrity. But on a scale of 1 to 12, if you've got ways to measure it, you can actually measure, call it your integrity meter.
Right. And if you are a family member in a family business and you feel that it would be useful to have more focus on the human element and the education of the family, but you might be alone in that and you still respect and love your family and you want people to get on and you don't want to be the one to rock the boat, so to speak, what do you do?
So, I call these individuals champions.
Mm-hmm.
These are the champions in the family, right? And they're typically the ones that are considered the outcasts, they're the outspoken ones. They're the ones that see what's coming down the pipe
Mm-hmm.
if things aren't addressed. And, these are precious, precious individuals in a family.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically, sometimes we start working with a family champion. And what happens is as we start working with them and they start to own their safe space, people see a change in them.
Mm.
And they go like, Elizabeth, did you do your hair? You look different. They don't know what it is, but there's a change in you and they're drawn to it and they want what you have. So then they get drawn in. So I have a family I would work with now for, I would say 2 years. So there is father started the business who recently passed away, 3 brothers. I started with the youngest brother, worked with him for a year. And then his second oldest brother said, I want to start working with Franco. I'm not sure what Paul's got, but I want to be a part of that. And then we finally got the older brother who was, very, what's the word I want to use? Skeptical about the process. We took him through an education day. And his comment was, he goes, I can't say no to this. This just makes so much sense, right? Because, you're talking about things that we know we need to do. So when can I get started?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're working with a 3rd generation. Right, we're actually we're in conversation about taking the 3 brothers and 3 of the 3rd generation members to Kenya, where we'll run the next generation program with the Maasai warriors in Kenya. So that's how far we've come from one family champion. The 11-year family relationship that started with one family champion. So family champions are incredibly valuable to the family, and if you are that individual, I would highly recommend that, find someone that you want to work with.
Mm.
And by the way, people ask me often, how do I know that a coach is the right person for me? And I'll say there's 2 questions you want to ask that person. Number 1 is, what's their issue? Because we all have one. If we're human beings, we've got one. And number 2, what are they doing about it? If they can't answer those questions, don't work with them.
Good advice. I wanted to come back to, you talked about money motto, and I just wanted to explore a little bit more that kind of relationship that we each have with money, because even if we think we don't have a relationship with it, because we might not feel we need to have an active relationship with it, we still do. Can you talk a bit about that and where it comes from and how we might identify ways in which it could be hindering us in terms of our participation in the family business system, and also in terms of our own level of comfort around where we're at in our life?
So we all have beliefs about men, women, God, sex, power. And we hang on to these beliefs like they're absolute truths, and we'll fight for them sometimes. So the one around money, I call it our money motto, M-O-T-T-O. And it's a subconscious belief that comes from an event in the past where we make a decision about how we feel about money or how we view money. And what's interesting is, the industry, and by that I mean, advisory and families tend to focus on the how piece of money. How do we make it? How do we save it? How do we transition it? Rarely do they consider why. Why do I do what I do with money? Why do I behave that way? Why do I spend? Why do I save? All that sort of stuff. And it comes from an individual's money model. So we help our families and individuals uncover what their money model is. And their money model will impact every single financial decision you make. It will impact how you earn it, gift it, inherit it, transition, negotiate for it. And sometimes it'll impact your relationships. Because we're relational beings, we take our money model into relationships. And because I'm really geeky and fascinated by this stuff, a number of years ago I did a study, and the question, I wanted the answer to one question. The question was, is there a connection or correlation between how we treat our money, or how we feel about it, or how we do money, and how we do our relationships, how we treat our relationships, and how we feel about it? And what I discovered is that they're directly correlated.
Right.
So how you treat your money is how you treat your relationships. So for some of you, boys and girls, that might be a scary realization. So everybody has a very specific money model, but it'll fall into one of four categories. You may want to write these down. The first one is the investor. So this is the individual that will invest their money, and they will also invest in relationships. They'll put in the time. They know that one day they may get a return. The second category is the spender. So they will spend their money, and they'll metaphorically spend their relationships. They're constantly taking from the relationships, depleting. There's a subcategory to this, in which is the self-spender. So they give away of themselves in service of others until they deplete themselves. Then there's the valuer respecter. This is the individual that really treasures and values their relationships.
Yeah.
And by the way, just because you're an investor doesn't mean you're going to value and respect. So that's what they're different. And the last one is the fearer, which is the individual that believes they don't deserve or are unworthy of money and wealth, so they'll self-sabotage. So they'll come home after a romantic weekend and pick a fight out of nowhere, or they'll invest in something that, they lose money just because they've got this belief in the background. So I find it fascinating that we're, as a society, we spend a lot of time on the how, never ask ourselves the why. So the other thing I like to talk about is what I call the safe space equation. Yeah. So if you can just write this down. So on the left-hand side of the page, I'm just going to give you guys a minute to start this. On the left-hand side of the page, write the word belief/story. Little arrow to the right, and write the word gig, G-I-G. Another arrow to the right, write the word or draw a mask, M-A-S-K. And then another arrow to the right and write two words, safe space. This is simplistically how we do life as human beings. So we all have a belief or a story, and when we get triggered, we will behave in a certain way. Our gigs will show up. And then because we don't feel safe and we don't really like to share what's going on in our lives, we will put on a mask that everything is great. I'm actually really happy. Things are fine at home, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, there may not be. And then what we seek, what we crave, what we long for is safe space, which is the other side of the mask. Now, here's the catch. The mask is simplistically the lie we tell ourselves to perpetuate the story and the belief and to justify our poor behaviors. When we operate in safe space, the mask and gigs cannot coexist.
Right. That makes sense. Could you give us an example of that as you've seen it in a client you work with? Yeah,
so let's go to the gig. So there is six categories. There's six gigs. So the first one is the avoider. This is the individual that avoids things, puts things off, right? Doesn't get to it. Then there is the people pleaser. They want to make everybody happy. They don't like to see people suffer. Then there's the rescuer. They want to come in and save the day. There is the manipulator, so they withhold information to gain favor.
Yeah.
There's the victim. It's never their fault. It's Trump or Brexit or something. And then finally, there is the right fighter. So they fight to be right. And as I tell my clients, there's not one better than the other. It's just like, some of us are gin and tonic people. Some of us are Pinot. Some of us like Cabernet. Some of us like whiskey. Some of us like beer. It's just our choice of behavior. It's about understanding what it is, because our behaviors impact relationships. Right? So, for example, I have a client of mine who is a people pleaser rescuer, right? And he's constantly trying to rescue his kids. So he's not allowing them to learn. So if I make the assumption that I need to rescue Elizabeth, what does that say about Elizabeth?
That I'm not very capable.
Right. And what's that going to do to our relationship eventually? You're going to resent me.
Yes.
Right. So in the book, Safe Space, I talk a lot about, what the characteristics are of these gigs, the payoff and the consequences. And most of them end up, the impact is people just don't trust us.
Yeah. And if you are to think about it in a sort of family enterprise context, there might be an operating business, there might be a family office, there might be a foundation. What are some of the things that you've helped people look at? And I think that the word stewardship comes up for me in that, especially as you talk about continuity. How do we steward all these different parts of our family enterprise in a way that is aligned with our own safe space?
Well, I think it starts with, how do we steward the human? How does Elizabeth steward herself first? Because the one thing about, investing in ourselves is we get to know ourselves better. We become more valuable to ourselves, and therefore more valuable to those around us. So it's about self-stewardship first.
Okay.
Right? And then once we have self-stewardship, we can have, relational stewardship. And then we can have the financial stewardship. But the focus typically is on the financial stewardship. But I have, there's a lot of families that say, we're going to use philanthropy as a way to educate the next generation on wealth and all this. And I think that's a great idea. But the fundamental issue I have with it is you're teaching someone to give away money they have not earned. Let's teach them how to earn money first before we give it away. Right? And let's teach them how to be good stewards of themselves. So let's teach them how to treat themselves with, generosity and grace and respect and kindness before they go do it outside. Right? So you asked me a question on how we've assisted a family with this safe space equation. So working with a family, they had a crane business that got Berkshire Hathaway bought them out, and father started the business. 3 siblings working in the business, and then shortly after the sale, the youngest son decided to have an affair, and his wife was his sister's best friend, so created some friction there. And mom's gig is the rescuer. So this young man, he's in his 40s, decided to sue his father for his perceived 1/4 of the sale of the business, proceeds of the sale, even though he was never a shareholder. And his mom paid the legal bill of the son suing her husband. That's a people pleaser to an extreme, rescuer to an extreme. Yeah. So what happens is we want to try and rescue people, we want to enable them, which is a disaster. And if we continually enable, we're going to create conflicts and challenges in the family, as opposed to empowering them, help them take full accountability and responsibility. Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about in the education day is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that all family businesses face. These are the 4 big issues. Right. The first one is affair versus equal. Yeah. Right. The second one is enabling versus empowerment. Are we enabling versus empowering? Yeah. And the difference is, enable is, well, that's just the way they are. That's what they do, as opposed to, hey, this person needs to take accountability and responsibility for their actions. Yeah. Right. Then there is the entitlement versus contribution. If we make life easy for the next generation, they're going to feel entitled to an easy life. We forget that wealth is created with struggle. Wisdom is gained with struggle. So let's not rob them of that opportunity. So once we struggle, then we become contributors. If we're not allowed to struggle, we become entitled. The fourth one is burden versus responsibility. And this is a big one, right? You know, burden is thrust upon, responsibility is chosen. You know, this father that had me work with his 3 sons gave them the opportunity to choose. They were responsible whether I want to work in the business or the outfit or not. But if it's thrust upon, it becomes a burden. And a lot of, you know, next generation members will feel the obligation to want to please mom and dad or their grandparents. So they take on the role of, you know, owner, operator, or CEO when they may have no interest in the business. And that is a massive, massive problem.
And how did they work their way through that? What were some of the things they had to realize?
Oh, so the Crane family. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we had to do was we had to, you know, kick the youngest son off the reservation, so to speak. So he was not allowed to be involved in the family office. He was not involved in any of those conversations, the decision making. He's still part of the family. We created a roadmap for him to earn his way back. So part of that included taking full accountability and responsibility for his actions. There was some financial pieces he had to deal with. He had to pay back the money he cost the family in defending themselves because he took them to court. We were able to create what are called some guiding principles, which is here's how we agree to behave with each other as a family. So the 3 guiding principles were honor the founder, which means everything we do, we respect dad because he's the one that created the wealth. The second guiding principle was everything we do for the family, not the individual. That means if I'm having a conversation with Elizabeth, I'm thinking about your needs, not just mine. And the last guiding principle for the family was if we invest, we expect a return. Mm-hmm. So if we invest in a building, we want a cap rate of X. If we invest in Elizabeth, we want a return out of you at bare minimum. You're not at the trough, milking the trough. You're self-sufficient, right? So guiding principles become a way of being, and that encapsulates the familial safe space that I was talking about.
I just wanted to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions, because we've got people who aren't able to type in questions because they've dialed in on a phone. So maybe we could just try and unmute people for just one moment, just to see if there are any questions for a second. Bear with us one moment. Are we able to do it? We have unmuted everybody just in case there are any questions from anyone who's either dialed in on a phone or joined us via web link. So please feel free to speak if there's any questions you want to ask. Nope. In that case, we'll just go back to mute and wait with us 1 second.
There we go. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, gladly. So the first one is fair versus equal, which is self-explanatory. And what happens is where this one comes up is, you know, let's say I'm a parent and I've got my 3 kids and I want to treat them all the same and treat them equally. So I'm going to create jobs for all 3 of them in the outfit, and they're all going to get paid the same. And that creates resentment because that's just not the way life works. There's different roles and responsibilities, and with that, there's different pay grades. The second one is enabling versus empowerment. So enable is we allow the behavior to continue. Empowerment is we ask that individual to take full accountability and responsibility for their behaviors. The third is entitlement versus contribution. And the final is burden versus responsibility. Hope that answers your question.
And could I come back to your 2 points about burden versus responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and also the entitlement and contribution piece? Could you say a little bit more? Let's start with the contribution piece because it's come up a few times. what have you, because you've written a book about this topic, and what are some of the things that you've seen people do to transition from one to the other, and what have been the sort of experiences that people have had in doing so? Because at the end of the day, I think we all want to feel like we're contributing something to a greater whole, but we might not always know how to do that. We might not always feel capable of doing that.
Yeah, so entitlement basically comes from a place of self. It's about me, what can I get out of it?
Mm-hmm.
Contribution is how can I serve others? And simplistically, when we went back to everything we do for reason piece, when we're operating from our story, from our negative belief, we're in a place of entitlement. When we're operating from a place of purpose and safe space, we're in a place where we're contributing. So the transition occurs when we realize that it's not about us, that it's really about we're here to serve. And how can I give back, and how can I make life easier, and at the same time, make a difference. So that's the fundamental change of entitlement to contribution. And the other thing I like to talk about entitlement is I wrote about this in my fourth book called Entitled Brat or Contributing Leader. Which one are you sure? Is that we think of an entitled brat, as that spoiled little rich kid having a temper tantrum. But in reality, every single one of us as human beings has a chance and at some point devolved into an entitled brat. Because we forget that we're entitled to our thoughts, belief, judgments, and prejudices. And when we don't get our own way in our belief system, we'll fight for those.
Yeah.
So we devolve into the entitled brat. Right? As opposed to, Elizabeth, you got your beliefs and I got mine. Let's agree to disagree on this one. That's okay, as opposed to I got to be right.
And how does that work out in a family business context where sometimes decisions need to be made and shareholders do need to find some form of alignment, even if it's not agreement?
So, it goes back to, what we help families create is what we call the Family Wealth Constitution, which simplistically is the rule book on how we as humans agree to play with each other in this thing called human relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if the humans can agree to be nice with each other, then the shareholders, when they put on that hat, or the family members when they put on that hat, or the CEO employee hat, it'll work. Because we've agreed to these guiding principles of, honor the founder, or everything we do for the family, or if we invest, we expect returns. It comes from that mindset, right? So it's a broader, overarching thing as opposed to the decision on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Right. And then if we've been able to operate in safe space, we're able to have those friendly debates without taking it personal. So one of the things that when we engage a family is we actually say, start practicing saying, Elizabeth, I need to have a safe space conversation. And you're going, okay, I need to get ready, hold the space for Franco to talk about what's going on, not judge him, not ridicule, but just hold the space.
Mm-hmm.
Because as human beings, we're craving it.
Yeah. And how do I avoid falling into the trap? If you tell me you want a safe space conversation with me, how do I avoid falling into the trap that I need to be scared of that? And somehow it might mean that you're not happy with the work I've done, or, because I think we can internalize a lot of things that get said to us.
So, for that conversation to occur, you will have done your individual safe space work as would have I.
Right. Okay.
Right. So there is a level of understanding what it means. You hold the space to listen for me to speak, as opposed to listening through your story or your lens of there's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
And that's basically the governance and action piece that I talk about.
And one of the things that we said on the website that we were going to look at today was, how do you hold intergenerational conversations about wealth? And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because sometimes it might be quite daunting to let the children know what kind of wealth there is actually in the family. Other times it might be difficult to tell them that one day this will all be theirs, and the fear of the burden it's going to put on them, and other times for the fear of what they might choose to do with it. And could you talk a bit about how do you have a meaningful conversation?
So how do you have a meaningful conversation around wealth is you talk about the human capital, because that's the foundation of family wealth, right? So if we have a human capital conversation around, Elizabeth feeling safe and all that, then that'll hold the space for the other conversation. Right? So we lead with the human capital piece because that's the most valuable piece. Right? And our belief is properly equipped next generation members will become incredible stewards and will grow the wealth exponentially.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not, 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It's 3 cubed. Right? So when we work with families, typically, if they do the work, it's a 27-time return. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about what's the number and what's the business. No, that's an incidental piece, because if we get the human capital piece right, you will feel safe one day holding this financial capital wealth.
Yes.
And the financial capital won't define you. You'll be defined by who you are. And by the way, there's this thing called the financial capital.
Right.
That's the conversation.
That's really
so when we do, for example, this next generation leadership training in Kenya, it's about overcoming your biggest fear. So we had a participant join us last year, and he would call himself the reluctant heir.
Right.
6th generation family member, and he remembers going to the shop and having the pictures of all the predecessors and the staff. Jimmy, one day this will all be yours, and when's your picture going to be up there? Can you imagine the pressure that puts on a 9-year-old? So he's like, why would I want to do this? I don't want to be part of this, even though he's the rightful heir. Right? So we were able to help him understand that he is who he is, regardless of this thing. And once he was able to say, okay, yes, I am this individual, then I can hold the financial capital.
Yeah. And if I could come back to one of the other points you made, which was fair versus equal. Because once you have you could have it in any generation, I suppose, but if you have a branch structure, and there might be 4 next generation members in one branch and 2 members of the next generation in another, and so on, that ownership piece may or may not be distributed fairly according to, I'm saying fairly in the minds of the people receiving it. So how do you help families have that conversation about the fact that 2 cousins are going to own more than the 4 cousins who happen to be part of a different branch? And how do you negotiate all of that complexity?
So, it boils down to, just because we all have the same last name and we're all part of the same family, we're not all the same. Right? So we may be the same family members, but we're not the same level of responsibility when it comes to ownership. If you got more shares, you've got more power. And with that comes more responsibility. Right? So, and what's interesting is whenever I track back, I'm working with a family right now, many, many shareholders. And, the issue is everyone thinks they got the same voice. As a family member, yeah. As a shareholder, no. Because some family members may have more shares than you, so they carry more weight. Right? So it's about really understanding that it's like the same thing, like let's say that we're siblings, Elizabeth, and you're the CEO in the firm, and I'm the plant manager. My voice isn't as strong as yours is. You got more responsibility. We're equals, but we're siblings, but in this particular circle, we're not. So families need to understand that depending on what circle you're at, whether it's the ownership circle, the family circle, or the business circle, we're not equals. It's like I'm not equal to my dad. My dad is my dad. He's got more power. Power is the wrong word. He's got more influence, more responsibility than I do. But we're family members. Yeah, I get it. Right? So, and what's interesting is all of the forces of the apocalypse, all those issues are led by the parent. And I'm not picking on parents. It's just the fact that is the primal hat we wear as parent first, then CEO, then shareholder. It's the parent that makes these decisions without being mindful that this is a business decision. What's the best thing for the business? What's the business decision, whether picking Jimmy or Johnny to work in the outfit?
Yeah.
I'm not going to put them there because they're my sons. No, you got to be merit. Right? Same thing with ownership. Just because you're my boys or my daughters doesn't mean you both get the shares. No.
So we're sort of coming up to the last 10 minutes of our time together here, and I just wanted to ask you what kind of advice you would give to a couple of different sort of scenarios of people and scenarios. So let's say I'm a next gen member who really wants to be a contributing part of the family, and I'm working towards that. Is there any advice that you would give me in terms of my own personal work?
Yeah, find someone to make you a better human.
Right.
Because if you become a better human, so the more we know about ourselves, so if you think of financial capital as a balance sheet, right? The more assets you have, less liabilities, the more net worth.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with, so we create what's called the human capital balance sheet. So the more you know about you, the more valuable you are. The less you know about you, the less valuable you are. So start to learn more about yourself. Then you become more valuable to yourself and those you potentially could end up serving in the family business.
Great. What about if I am a senior generation family member and I'm in charge of educating the next generation? What advice would you give me? Would it be exactly the same?
Exactly the same. Increase your human capital knowledge. Because, everything we do for a reason. And, a lot of senior members say, you know what, I'm ready to give it over, but I'm not. So what's the reason behind that? What's the real reason?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And some of it could be, you could have a good reason, but is it really the reason? Right? So the more I go back to, the more we know, the more we understand ourselves as human beings, the more valuable we are to those we serve. And that includes shareholders, executives, and certainly our family.
And just another sort of question that sprang to mind is when we work with non-family, and many family businesses are run by non-family, what are some of the ways in which that relationship can be strengthened? Because when it works well, it works beautifully, but sometimes it can be difficult for both sides to find the balance in that relationship. And what have you seen are some of the key things that either the non-family, say CEO or chairman, or the family need to bear in mind for that relationship to work? Because that's a different dynamic again.
So, in a recent interview of a family, one of the non-family executives came up with a quote, which I love. It says, culture will eat strategy for breakfast all day long. Mm. Right? So it goes back to, does that shareholder family member feel safe with themselves as an individual? And then does that non-family member executive feel safe with themselves as an individual? Right. And then can they create relational safety?
So it's the relational safety piece that's crucial too.
Yes, but we can't have relational safety until we have individual safety. Yeah. Right? So it goes individual safety, relational safety, familial safety, and then ultimately cultural safety, which is the management and the family together.
That makes absolute sense. I'm just going to check if there's anybody who hasn't had their burning questions answered. So I'm just going to unmute everybody for a brief moment just to see if anybody wants to ask any final questions or make any points. So everybody's now unmuted. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to speak.
Don't be shy.
Or that you can also type your question if you prefer. Anonymously or not, as it were. Nope, I don't see any questions coming up. So I'm just going to mute people again. So
I'd just like to leave all of you with one of my, actually two of my favorite quotes. This is from Søren Kierkegaard, who's a very famous Danish philosopher. And he says that life has to be understood backwards and lived forwards.
Very true.
And the other one is from Galileo. And Galileo says that all truths are easy to understand once uncovered.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The key. My question to you is, what are you doing to uncover whatever your truth may be? For it is in your truth that you will be in purpose and creating stewardship for those you serve, which is your family.
What an absolutely powerful way to end the webinar. It has been a pleasure and a privilege as always. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your honesty, for your contribution. And I look forward to many more conversations with you about these topics. And I'm sure that if anybody has any questions, we would be happy for them to reach out after the webinar in case something comes up.
Yep, you could share my personal email address if people want to reach out and have private questions. Feel comfortable to reach out. Happy to talk to you.
Brilliant. We will also be sharing the link to the webinar in case anybody wants to share it more widely amongst their family members. So thank you all for joining. Thank you very much, Francesco. Always a pleasure.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to serve the IFB.